He first noticed the sirens as a thin ribbon of sound under the roar of the crowd, like something far away trying to be heard through glass. Then the cameras turned, then the headlines flattened the city into black and white. The bus that had been full of afternoon commuters lay on its side like a folded paper boat. Airbags spilled open like white flowers, and for a moment, the whole world concentrated on the hospital doors, where people moved in and out with the exact rigid motion of those who had learned how to carry bad news professionally. Shao was there before she had any right to be. She had arrived on a bus that smelled faintly of diesel and rain, her purse clutched to her side, the strap cutting a pale line into her palm. She had been late to the meeting she'd been hired for a week earlier, late to the audition she had wanted for years, but those were small private losses. This was a public thing, a calamity that rearranged names and faces like playing cards. Her mother, who had been the one to teach her how to fold a napkin into a rose and how to say a stubborn no without apologizing afterward, had been taken from the crush of passengers and put under fluorescent lights, a thin tube at her wrist, a blanket tucked awkwardly around knees that had never learned to stop. Around Shao, phones hovered like silent witnesses. A technician in a blue scrub jacket kept saying, "We're doing everything we can," and the phrase felt both sterile and tender. People breathed, the hospital breathed with them. And somewhere, beyond the cluster of nurses and the smell of antiseptic and coffee, the world informed itself again. The CEO had been in the vicinity. The CEO's car had been seen leaving the scene earlier. The CEO's name was in the same paragraph as a famous actress. He'd been there briefly, in a suit that made him look like the rest of the architecture, clean lines, deliberate choices. Gu was a man whose public movements read like press releases. In the days since the accident, cameras had painted him as both present and absent. A hand at the perimeter of the emergency room, a guarded face in interviews, 1,000 small apologies that never reached the knuckles of the life that mattered most to Shao. He had touched her shoulder in the hall once, and that had been all the intimacy she had received for months. They had married in a ceremony that looked like a turning point in a film. White roses, an orchestra that played slightly too loudly to cover nerves, a photograph in which Shao smiled like someone who had decided, for the cameras and for herself, to put her heart somewhere safe. The photograph lived now in a box in her bedroom, its edges soft, and when she ran her fingers across it, she could feel, beneath the glossy paper, the press of a blue shirt folded just so, a shirt he always wore on days he wanted to appear accessible. The blue shirt hung in their closet, a small, incontestable fact. Once, during a thunderstorm, his arm had brushed hers beneath the table at a charity gala, and the blue of the shirt had seemed to glow like safety. Later, it would become a thread she could follow back to what had been taken. Rumors, like stray embers, do most of their damage at night. They found their way to her, by text, by the rumbling of the news vans outside a restaurant, and finally by a photograph that showed him laughing too closely with Yao, the actress who populated tabloid margins. Yao with her habit of turning a look into a headline. Yao with her hair caught in soft, perfect waves. Yao who wore gowns the way some women wore confidence as a coat. She was both an enigma and a fixture in entertainment columns, a face that could be invited into someone else's failure and make it seem like an accessory. The first hospital night passed without sleep. Shao learned to sit in the same stiff chair for hours, to count the tick of an old clock in the lobby, to let other people cry in front of her without deciding whether they deserved it. She learned also to judge absence differently, not as lack but as accumulation. She had spent years living beside a man who was, in public, a kind of empire, meetings, subsidiaries, a voice on the news delivering statements. At home, there had always been schedules, his, hers, the quiet ones that fit between them. When she reached for him in the small hours and found only the echo of his scent on a pillow, she told herself it was only the cost of being married to someone who could buy influence with a phone call. It was easier then to call such quiet a fact rather than a violation. In the morning, beneath fluorescent lights that made everything look more finite, a producer from one of the channels found her. A polite man with a tidy tie who wanted to say how sorry he was, and who wanted also to ask for her voice on camera. "Anyone who was tied to the incident?" he said, choosing the words like a careful surgeon. They wanted a statement. They wanted the human angle. They wanted the frame that would keep viewers from changing channels. Shao said nothing. She had learned long ago that the true statements lived in a different language, the slow closure of a book, the careful folding of clothes, a note left on the kitchen table. For now she would be patient. For now she would inventory what was hers. A childhood spent on a thrift store sofa, with a mother who loved late-night cooking, a few unpaid bills on top of others, a dignity that felt frayed by every headline. He was in the background of her days more than present. Brief messages, the occasional transfer notification, a call that came at exactly 2:14 a.m. and ended before she could answer because he had entered a meeting about a subsidiary in Beijing. He called when he needed absolution. "How's your mother?" he would ask, and those words were always careful as glass ornaments. But once, at a private party where the microphones were off and the cameras were not, they had danced very close and he had said, low enough that only she could hear, "I could do this for you, anything." She had believed him in the way people believe promises spoken in rooms they want to keep. Days bled into one another along a single anxious axis. The mother in a bed, the hospital wristband, the waiting. The press planted stakes in the lawn of their marriage and the stakes bowed their way. People who had been friends became editors. A server at a cafe glanced too long at her and offered a judging smile she could not place. Social feeds hung over the city like banners, and on them people speculated about motives, alliances, and the precise shape of betrayal. The audition happened because there was nothing else she could do that felt like ownership. She had once wanted to act, to tell other people's truths on stage, and somewhere between making a house and learning not to ask too many questions, that hunger had gone quiet. The audition room was small, all mirrors and nervous energy. She arrived carrying an old script and a notebook with margin notes she had made in pencil. A casting director in a blazer with chipped nail polish barely looked up. The room smelled faintly of hairspray and the echo of other women's rehearsals. Shao prepared and breathed, and told herself, firmly, that this was not about him. It was, of course, also about him. The role she wanted had been rumored to be a perfect fit for someone connected to a producer who often worked with Yao. The irony was not lost on Shao. She walked into a room where people selected faces and histories, and sometimes chose according to alliances more than talent. The director asked her to read. She chose a monologue from memory, one about a woman who decides to leave the only home she has ever known. That evening, when she finished, and people applauded politely, the director smiled at Yao's publicist, not at her. Humiliation arrives in small increments before it becomes a blow. A photograph taken at the wrong angle, a producer's laugh that lands squarely in her chest, a text from someone who used to be friendly offering an "I'm so sorry" that read like a verdict. Her character, once a private thing, became a commodity. The actress Yao took the role she had auditioned for. There were polite messages from the director, "You were close, talent, definitely," which felt like the sugarcoating of a rejected application. She left with her head held high, but the weight of everyone's expectations clinging to her like wet clothes. Home for Shao had become an exhibit. Their living room was tastefully sparse, the kind of space designed to photograph well at charity events. A vase of orchids that never quite died sat on the mantel. The blue shirt was folded in the closet, as always, its collar as stiff as an unread letter. That night, she opened a drawer and found a bracelet she'd forgotten she owned. It had been a gift, a small strand of beads her mother had given her for courage. One bead had snapped loose and rested in the palm of her hand like an accusation. The decision brewed quietly beneath the rhythm of the day and the slashing headlines. Divorce, she told herself, was not about punishment. It was language. It was saying to the world and to herself that she was not invisible. She wanted no part of being a background figure in a life that was narrated by other people. There was also practical armor to consider. Money detaches needs from the mercy of someone who might one day stop caring. The number planted itself in her mind not as greed, but as architecture for independence. 1 billion. Not a childish demand, but a boundary. If he valued his public tranquility more than the dignity she had been denied, then let him trade a tidy pile of numbers for the right to continue ignoring what he had already displaced. He noticed, as men like him notice things that could wrench a conversation into a headline. Gu sat across from her at a negotiation room, his gestures precise, the way the corner of his mouth tightened when anyone mentioned the word reputation. They were surrounded by a small army of people who smelled faintly of polished leather and legal briefs. Papers lay between them like tiny battlegrounds. She placed her signature on a blank line in a way that was both defiant and perfectly ordinary. It was, she thought, a ceremonial act. "I want to be free," she said, and her voice surprised her by not shaking. The room filled with the sound of pens scratching, like a chorus of small indifferent instruments. He tried bargaining first with charm. "We'll arrange support," he said, the words packaged in the tone of a man with options. He offered a foundation, money that could be filtered through charities and accounts, and the promise of privacy that came with that kind of wealth. She had photographs of him leaving an event with Yao tucked away in her phone, but she had ideas of fairness she could not trade for hush money. The number, when she said it, landed on the table with the unfamiliar weight of arithmetic and principle. $1 billion as a form of guarantee not just of financial independence, but of autonomy, of separation from the soft violence of being kept. Gu's eyes narrowed, and for a sliver of a second, she saw the man who had once wanted to do everything for her, the partial younger man who had tried to shelter her from petty embarrassment. Then the armor returned. "That amount is outrageous," he said, which was another way of saying he did not see that the injury required such a response. He tried a different tactic. Minimization. "We can arrange something that will protect your interests," he suggested, as if poverty were a hypothetical possibility she needed shielding from. She signed the request for divorce months later, on a Thursday morning that smelled of rain. The photocopier in the law office coughed and spat paper that would later be quoted and replayed. The assistant who had been more attentive in the past was the same one who came now bearing a small envelope with the notation, "For Shao." Inside was a single photograph of a man in a suit, smiling in a way that did not belong to their life, but to the life that he had purchased with his charisma. The photograph found its way into the press under the headline that suggested indiscretion merely as entertainment. People brandished opinions as if they were gifts. After the filing, public curiosity flipped like a switch into a different frequency. Social media clogged with sympathetic posts. There were calls for scandal, for explanations, for the production of a marital crime scene. The actress Yao, whose every public move was the subject of analysis, posted a carefully composed image of herself wearing minimal makeup and a neutral expression. The comments beneath it were a net of praise and vitriol that revealed how small, in the mind of the crowd, truth had become. Shao began to work, not because she wanted pity, but because she wanted currency that couldn't be reduced to rumors. She took small jobs, an assistant on a set, a continuity checker, anything that let her be near the pulse of creativity without being subsumed by it. In the studio, she found both refuge and humiliation. Refuge because the people there were engaged in the daily miracle of turning scripts into images. Humiliation because each time she raised her hand to suggest something, someone would assume she had learned her tastes from trend pieces. Yet she felt herself being remade by the small, steady labor of showing up. It was a new kind of presence, not ornamental, but functional. Gu moved through those months like a man trying to keep a glass empire from toppling. He made statements to the press that were careful as hedges. He arranged for philanthropic gestures that the tabloids filmed as if they were absolution. Occasionally, in a private corner, he would call her mother to inquire about medication regimens or to send an expensive flower arrangement. The gestures were not all cold. There were moments when his face would crack into a human shape and his voice grew soft. He did not, however, step into the full domestic life of attending to the small, unphotogenic needs of their household. He remained, in all decisive ways, performative. The city seemed delighted by the rupture. Cafes turned into editorial labs where people dissected every nuance. Why would a man with everything forsake a home for a spotlight? Why would an actress willingly step into an established marriage without caring for its wreckage? The answers, if there were any, were messy and always provisional. Newspapers printed side-by-side images. A photo of Gu at a gala, smiling. A photo of Shao in the fluorescent kitchen of a set, tired but upright. The blue shirt became a symbol in the minds of many, a simple corporate shade that, in its ubiquity, suggested he could wear carelessness as easily as he could wear a tie. One evening, after a day of rehearsals and seeing a production manager's sympathetic look that she could neither accept nor dismiss, Shao stood in the rain outside a studio. Water ran in slender ribbons down the curve of her face like cheap stage makeup, and cars shed light across the asphalt in moving strips. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the cold bead of the broken bracelet her mother had once tied on her wrist. The bead had long since been lost, but its ghost kept her steady. In the reflection of a puddle, she could see a woman who was not yet whole, but who was being found between the beats of hardship. It was then she realized the difference between being hurt and being defined by hurt. Pain was part of her story, but it would not be the only chapter. She began to move, little things at first, an application, a meeting, a refusal to answer a phone call from people who wanted something from her and nothing for her. She deleted some social accounts, filed others, learned how to scan contracts. Movement became a verb, and with it, a kind of safety. If he had chosen the lights, she would learn to build her own. The press noticed movement and translated it into fodder. Headlines framed agency as spectacle. Wife files, billion-dollar demand shocks tycoon. A headline read beneath a photo of Gu smiling too deliberately. Comments poured like rain, some scolding, many curious. The city wanted drama and categorized her choices as either righteous revolt or opportunistic theater. Neither label fit. She was a woman who had been ignored and who was learning, painfully and with a stubborn intelligence, how not to be. Gu watched this from a distance cushioned by drivers and publicists. In the privacy of his car, he sometimes let his mask slip. He remembered, not with bitterness but with a particular kind of regret, small acts of care he'd taken when their marriage felt new, holding the door open for her in cold weather, sending her a single red rose on a day that had been hard. Those gestures had been real, even if now they belonged to a different era of himself. He told himself he had not meant to be cruel. He told himself that the work had been necessary, that the empire required a leader with no slack. But looking at the headlines and counting the cost, he also felt the first deep stirrings of a thing that might have been guilt. There was a scene later, a public moment that would be replayed and boiled down into a few seconds of looped footage. The company hosted a fundraiser, and both Gu and Yao attended, their images placed next to one another, as if the world were asking them to produce a single story from their proximity. Flashbulbs popped. Shao, by then accustomed to being in the periphery, stood near a service table and watched the room fill with people who would later write about how calm everything seemed. Gu, across the room, laughed in a way that invited no one to join. Yao received an award that night and gave a speech about courage as if courage were a product you could label and ship. Shao left before the toast ended and the photographers trailed her like a comet's tail. She walked into a cold night, the city lights bending, and thought for the first time about what it meant to be invisible in your own marriage. The thought did not collapse her, it clarified her. It became a lens through which every small slight, missed call, a hand that withdrew, the rumor that got louder as the days passed, was suddenly readable. She would not, she decided, be the person the newspapers wanted her to be, a wounded ornament swallowed by spectacle. She would be someone who moved in the world and left footprints in places that mattered. She would audition again. She would find work. She would, if she had to, take the billion and use it to build a life that no headline could fold into an anecdote. Stay with her, if you want to see how she turns the tables. After the soft public mirror of the fundraising night, things accelerated. The divorce filing that had been a quiet rupture now announced itself as a headline. The legal teams exchanged scripted statements that smelled of cedar and canned confidence. Gu's office drafted responses. His grandmother, an old woman whose opinions had steered marriages and corporate alliances for decades, sent an emissary whose manner suggested that this was a family matter to be handled like a ledger. The pressure came from all directions. The public wanted a scandal, his associates wanted damage control, and at home the apartment hummed with the silence of unresolved things. Shao negotiated with a clarity she would have envied in younger women who seemed born into certainty. She wanted, among other things, guardianship of her own narrative. To her the billion was not trophy money. It was a line drawn in a ledger that said, in black ink, "I will not be erased." Her demand sent a message as obvious as a letter in an envelope. Independence would cost him something he could not simply ignore. Gu, who had learned to parse threats in mergers and to reassign assets with a penstroke, experienced the demand as an escalation. He had expected that she might be hurt and might ask for something practical, maintenance, property, the kind of standard arrangement that smoothed reputations. $1 billion, however, was public and dramatic, and its very audacity would itself attract attention. His counsel argued numbers and precedent, but in private he felt something more primitive. The fear that his private life would no longer be negotiable in the way corporate holdings were. The scandal could seep into the stock forum, influence partnerships. The affair, once an ember between him and a public woman, had become a wildfire with curiosity as fuel. In the center of those days, in hospital rooms and corporate corridors, Shao learned the hard arithmetic of solitude. People offered help and then retreated when the cameras focused elsewhere. A friend who had once promised loyalty announced from a distance that she needed to stay neutral for their career. Another came to the apartment with a bag of groceries, eyes raw with the sorrow of being present in the way real friends sometimes are, clumsy, essential, imperfect. Shao accepted what she needed and refused what would have been pity. At night, when the city softened and news vans parked like moths that never slept, she walked the streets in comfortable shoes and rehearsed lines that had nothing to do with public statements. She tried to imagine a future that did not pivot on him. In those imaginings, she saw herself teaching, perhaps, or running a small studio that made shows about women like her. Unassuming, complicated, carrying histories that tasted like lemon rind and cigarette smoke. It was a small fantasy, but it had its own gravity. Gu, in the office, encountered a different kind of collapse. His colleagues calculated losses and spin. There were late meetings in which men with polished accents suggested settlement, like it was a product they were launching. He met with a PR team that diagrammed narratives and rehearsed apologies that would never quite reach the particular sting of what he had failed to do. In an empty conference room with a digital skyline behind him that rendered the city into glass and light, he allowed himself the luxury of honesty for the first time in months. I didn't intend to hurt her, he admitted to his reflection, to the world, maybe to himself. But I did. The admission was not catharsis. It was a small, icy recognition. And the city watched. Opinion columns multiplied. There were think pieces about power and privacy, interviews that tried to parse the motives of an actress who had once smiled at charitable causes. Some opined that his responsibilities to a corporation were incompatible with domestic attentiveness. Others declared that he was a man entitled to his personal life. Shao found the commentary oppressive because it insisted on simplifying her suffering into a lecture on gender or on celebrity. In the stairwells of the studio where she worked, young assistants whispered hypotheses. She held herself steady because she had to, and because movement itself had become a kind of argument. The hospital that had first convened their crisis remained a kind of stage. Between the machines and the waiting rooms, Shao learned to sit in ways that required no performance. She learned what to say to doctors so that they would not talk over her, and she learned to ask for things in a tone that made people take her seriously. Her mother's condition fluctuated like weather, sometimes brightening in ways that looked cruelly hopeful, sometimes clouded. Friends came and left. Reporters camped outside hospital entrances like predators. One night, when the rain fell the way rain in films does, slow, luminous, forgiving, she sat with her mother's hand, small and warm, and told her an ordinary story about a childhood bicycle and a scraped knee. The story felt like a lifeline. But grief, when it arrived in the fullest sense, arrives with a clarity that leaves no room for argument. The doctors spoke in phrases that were precise and blunt. We did everything, they said, which meant, in their practical, luminous way, the body has made an ending. The hospital room that had felt like a shelter became suddenly a place where the hush of absence pressed against the curtains. When the end came, it did so with the dignity of someone who had refused to theatrically prolong the scene. Shao sat for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling and seeing instead 1,000 possible futures scroll by like badly edited film. The funeral was not for the cameras. It was small and bittersweet, attended by those who had known the woman beyond headlines and by a handful of distant relatives who whispered condolences in polite, practiced tones. Gu did not attend. The message he sent, an arrangement of flowers and a note about regret and condolences, was a thing of formal language. People noticed his absence and turned it into an allegory. The man who could not tear himself from the thing that made him famous had also deserted the funeral of a woman who had raised the person who loved him. Shao stood before the crowd that had gathered in the small chapel and felt, not the anticipated collapse but a terrible steadiness. The grief was real and complete, a fact she would carry like a book with its spine cracked. But beneath the grief was a new understanding of herself. She had a capacity to withstand a public storm and to keep moving. The deed that followed, the filing of divorce papers, and the public statement that accompanied it, was less an act of vindictiveness than of declaration. She would not be someone to be quietly discarded. Life continued in its small, inexorable ways. Contracts were drafted, numbers were named in boardrooms, and the city's appetite for drama proved insatiable. Gu attempted gestures that some would call contrition and others called damage control. Yao continued to shine on the red carpet, adding to the chorus of people who had something at stake in this delicate, unfolding spectacle. Yet even as the world turned its attention into a magnifying glass and heated the air with rumor, a quieter narrative began to thread itself through the public one. A small girl in a pediatric ward, a child with a fragile smile and a bowl of hair that had been thinned by medicine, became a hinge. Nurses moved her bed sometimes into a quieter alcove, and visitors would stand and talk in soft voices about prognosis and donors, about marrow matches and the temperament of courage in children. The child's presence in the hospital, a peripheral detail at first, came to connect to them in ways nobody expected. It was as if the city's dramas, money, fame, betrayal, would have to contend with a more humbling calculus. The simple need of a child for someone willing to offer life without theatricality. Shao, who had learned to move, found herself also learning to wait. The waiting was not passive, it was a form of action. She sent messages, not for PR but to gather facts, to help someone she did not yet know. It felt strange to act with kindness without calculation, to take steps that would not be turned into a headline that could be clipped and sold. The act was a small rebellion against a world that insisted on monetizing everything. In late-night conversations with friends who had been with her since college, she spoke in the language of ordinary people, who would cook, who would check on a neighbor. They listened, and then gently asked the question she had not wanted to answer before. Was there room for forgiveness in a life that had been publicly injured? She did not know. She had months of proof that public performance and private disregard could coexist in a man whose public gestures were so often elaborate. Yet it was also true that human hearts and alliances are not always simple, and that sometimes people change through suffering. Gu, meanwhile, began to see consequences he had not fully anticipated. Donations and philanthropic projects he'd flung into the world came under scrutiny. Board members whispered about stability. Shareholders asked questions that could not be answered with charm. The affair had become both a private wound and a public risk, and no amount of well-placed philanthropy could pretend otherwise. He felt his public authority shift under his feet. For the first time, he had to think about himself in a way that the cameras could not edit into a simple tale. As the city spun its narratives, columns, sketches, late-night commentary, Shao found that moving on was less a single dramatic step and more a choreography of small acts. She took the small, steady jobs. She reclaimed old tastes. She cultivated relationships that were not measured by their usefulness to fame. She let her hair grow out of a style that had once been dictated by someone else. She bought a used typewriter, then sold it, replacing it with a small laptop that felt less nostalgic and more functional. These were not grand gestures. They were the labor of reconstructing a life that felt hers. And in a simple private moment, one that would later be quoted by tabloids hungry for contrast, she folded the blue shirt and placed it in a drawer marked, not theirs, but neutral. The shirt did not belong to anyone anymore, except the memory of a man who had worn it when he wanted to look accessible. The act felt small and monumental at once, a neat piece of fabric folded like a page turned. It was in that place, precisely, that the shift became visible. The man who had been ignored, because of fame, because of a woman who made headlines, found himself suddenly aware that the agency he had taken for granted had slipped from his hands. He watched as she moved through the city, a woman unembellished by gossip, who nevertheless carried an almost visible light that came from knowing your own mind. The light unsettled everyone who thought they had understood the geometry of their lives. Public jealousy followed in the expected pattern. It began as a quiet, private sting, and then swelled into the kind of spectacle that makes people assign blame in loudness. He felt it not merely as shame but as a hunger to repair an order he had broken, and his attempts at repair were messy, sincere at times, performative at others. But the damage had been done. He had ignored her while the world cheered elsewhere, and her movement away from that dynamic initiated a set of events neither of them could fully predict. A new, invisible script had been written, one that insisted on dignity, on the hard work of rebuilding, and on the possibility that, no matter how loud the cameras, life keeps asking for honesty. And the city, hungry for the next installment, leaned forward as if to hear whether anyone would deliver it. The city did not forgive easily. It reprinted apologies and photographed contrition in slow motion until every nuance had been catalogued and sold. But there are things the press cannot fold neatly into a column. The way a child's breath can hitch under fluorescent lights. The exact sound of a woman who has decided she will not be erased. Those things kept Shao, to the world that had begun to call her by a single name, and the small hospital room at the edge of the pediatric ward, tethered to one another through different kinds of urgency. The documents arrived in an envelope whose edges had been softened by too many hands. A nurse who had once worked nights at the municipal transport depot slipped them to Shao at the cafeteria, a tired woman with a pencil behind her ear. "They asked me to burn them," she said. "I couldn't." The papers were rough photocopies, maintenance requests stamped and ignored, a line of emergency calls that had gone unanswered the night the bus folded itself like paper. A series of invoices that linked a small subcontractor to a firm with the same account names that appeared in Gu Holdings' quieter ledgers. Someone had tried to fix the past by hiding the paperwork. Someone else had kept a copy. Shao read until the cafeteria lights blurred into a smear. The evidence was not cinematic enough to be a definitive smoking gun. There were gaps, silences, initials with no faces, but it bent the shape of the accident into a different gravity. The bus had not simply skidded. Someone had known the brakes were compromised. A maintenance contractor had been pressured to delay inspections. The chain led to vendors who, in whispered phone calls transcribed in the documents, discussed reputations and handling problems quietly. If this was true, the accident that had started the chain of losses in the city was not merely a misfortune, but a failure shaped by choices. The idea lodged itself in Shao like a splinter. It changed everything she already felt about the gulf that had been growing between her and Gu. If the empire he navigated allowed corners of safety to fray for the sake of profit or convenience, then her small private injuries fit into a larger pattern. She could see suddenly how private neglect could be structural. She brought the papers to someone who would not ask for narrative headlines, but who knew how to read the language of ledgers. An investigative journalist named May, whom she had met once at a charity where food trays collected more conversation than the podium. May read in the hush of a small cafe until midnight. Then she made a call and did what reporters do when a story is raw. They began to gather a chain of corroboration. Meanwhile, the hospital bed in Ward 5 took on a new kind of urgency. Coco's fever crested and fell like a cruel tide. The marrow markers, the medical staff explained without melodrama, showed her immune system faltering in a way that suggested immediate transplant. The typical donors were often found among family, but Coco's genetic profile made a family match uncertain. The registry was being scoured. The announcements that would have been bureaucratic in another life, lists of tissue types, cross-match results, read in the press of waiting rooms like prayers. Word of Coco's condition reached public ears through a small earnest post from a pediatric nurse that a volunteer had shared. The post did not name names, but it threaded parents and volunteers into the story. Someone recognized the child in a grainy photograph as the little girl whose mother had died in the accident months ago. The child who had become, in an odd way, a central symbol of what had been lost. The city's appetite for a neatly tied story collided with a stranger, a generosity that refused to be edited. Yao Kenshin watched television differently now. She had been built, publicly, to read well under lights. Interviews and magazine covers had taught her the grammar of charm. But interviews do not teach the precise ache of seeing a small face tangled in tubes. The footage of Coco looked like a thing that could not be reduced to a subplot. Off camera, Yao called a hospital line and asked a question that made the administrative woman on the other end exhale. Could she be tested? It was a simple human decision dressed in the bright coat of publicity. Yao's team tried to dissuade her. Logistics, risk, the calculus of headline management. but she persisted. She presented herself in a plastic cold clinic, sleeves rolled, eyes free of makeup, and submitted to blood tests that would tell whether she matched the little girl who had become, for reasons neither of them asked to analyze, a hinge between strangers. When the match came back positive, it was the kind of thing headlines had been trained to love. A star who had been the object of gossip now performed an act that could be called heroic. The press would later clip the sequence into tidy frames, the glove sliding over her handshake with the surgeon, the hospital corridor full of bright vinyl and measured footsteps. But in the wards, in rooms where monitors hummed like insects, there was only a human exchange. A hand squeezed, a nurse's throat tightening, a mother who had lost a child watching another adult offer a possibility. For Shao, the donation complicated the script she had been handed by months of betrayal and public ridicule. She had once wanted to aim anger like a bright arrow at Yao. Now she had to hold two things at once: how public infidelity had cut her, and how a woman she had once reduced to a headline was letting another child live. It made her feel both foolish for the clarity she had wished for, and grateful in a way that flattened argument. The moral equations of the world are rarely simple. She felt simultaneously owed reparation and called to steadiness. Gu watched the arc of these events like a man feeling an injury he could not name. Yao's donation turned public sympathy in ways he had not anticipated. He had, in the months since the filings, hired counsel and stabilized what he could in boardrooms. But influence has margins. It does not make people indifferent to the human effect of headlines. He saw Shao at the hospital a few times, always brief, always controlled, and sometimes, when the cameras were off, he allowed himself to be small and soft, in ways no one else documented. He watched Yao perform a private mercy that made him taste a bitterness he had not expected, jealousy at her closeness to heroes, and, worse, an envious ache that Shao could stand in proximity to life in a way his attention could not buy back. This particular kind of jealousy is quiet and corrosive. It gallops not by loud accusations, but by the slow birth of the question: what did he deserve if the woman he had ignored could now be seen as brave for simply not turning away? Gu, when alone, sat in his car and watched videos of the ward. He thought of the blue shirt folded like a memory in a drawer, and felt an ache that quickly hardened into logistic thinking. He called counsel. He called PR. He called his mother's emissary. People like him move quickly from feeling to containment, but containment is not the same as atonement. The documents that May and her sources pulled together did not dissolve into public reckoning with a single press release. They required voices, names spoken aloud to make the paper trail legible. May could release a story that would name vendors and provide startling context, but the decision to publish was always loaded like a pistol with someone else's shame. May asked Shao in the hushed corner of the cafe if she would put her name to it. Shao remembered the small, decisive way she had filed for divorce and the signature that felt both ordinary and sacred. She understood the risk involved in letting the chain of documents out into the light. If she attached herself to this story, she risked being recast as a crusader or an opportunist, a trope the city loved to chew over. But there is a dimension to dignity that is not celebrity, an insistence that what is wrong be said out loud. For reasons that had less to do with revenge than requirements of conscience, she agreed. May's article dropped like a stone into still water. It named accounts, traced transactions, and printed dates when calls had been made and not returned. The piece did not, because it could not, prove criminal intent beyond question. It suggested negligence and a culture of deferred maintenance justified by fiscal prudence. The public response was immediate. A small coalition of parents whose children had been injured that night called for hearings. The stock reacted as the market does to scandal. CEOs of competitors called for transparency. The board at Gu Holdings convened an emergency meeting. The city leaned forward to see whether an empire could be made to account for the edges it had allowed to fray. Gu's grandmother, whose voice was as dry and exact as a ledger, summoned emergency counsel. Her words, in private conversations that were inevitably recorded and leaked, were a grid of possibilities. "Handle it," she said at one meeting. But handle now had a different, sharper feel in the new light. The families standing, their philanthropic arms, the sense of continuity that had always underwritten their public face, these were at risk. Men in suits drew diagrams and prepared statements. They suggested donations, funded research centers, and crafted narratives about corporate responsibility. It was, in its own way, the choreography of accountability. May's reporting triggered investigators at the municipal level. Subpoenas were sent. Vendors were compelled to produce logs. A maintenance contractor, facing the real possibility of litigation, finally did the thing that small companies sometimes do when the pressure is unbearable. They offered names, dates, and receipts. The chain of suppression became visible in fragments. The lights in the city flashed in a new color, one that made even Gu's allies look askance at each other. In the week, the city felt like it might be reconfiguring itself. The hospital called a meeting. They had two pieces of news. 1. Arguments were being made to prioritize Coco for a match because of the younger child's fragile condition. 2. They had documentation that a potential donor, Yao Kenshin, was cleared and ready. The medical team said plainly that surgery was scheduled and that the risks and probabilities were what they were. None of their language was dramatic, yet in small rooms where monitors beeped, everything felt perilously dramatic all the same. The transplant was an exhaustion of hope and technique. Yao's marrow was harvested. Nurses moved with the precise choreography of people who do not make promises but who are instrumental in giving seconds of life. The operation went on for hours, then days. Recovery diagrams ticked slowly upward like a patient score. The fever dropped. Coco opened her eyes one afternoon and smiled at an IV stand that had become a familiar witness. The ward that had once seen a chorus of quiet had for a moment something that resembled jubilation. On the day Coco reached a stable plateau, a press conference convened in the hospital's small auditorium. Reporters crowded in, desperate for the thread of humanity that could neatly be photographed. Yao stood at the podium in a plain sweater, which made her seem almost shockingly small in a room used to spectacle. May had continued reporting on the accident, and the press had constricted around two arcs. A corporate negligence story and a separate human story where a woman offered a life to a child she did not know. Acts do not erase choices, Shao said later, privately, to a friend when she tried to reconcile the contradictions of being grateful and wounded. But sometimes, an act asks you to expand what your grief contains. She was not ready to be magnanimous as a posture. She felt the impulse toward moral nuance as one might feel a complicated weather front, necessary, shifting, and unpredictable. The unraveling of the accident's cover-up had a different kind of heat. An internal memo surfaced in which a mid-level operations manager had forwarded concerns to a regional director who, according to the chain, had been told to delay a safety check. The names led, frustratingly, to an amalgam of business practices that seemed to prefer reputation over immediacy of repair. The investigators built a case of negligence, at least to the degree that corporate practices could be deemed reckless. And when a witness, an ex-employee of a subcontractor, testified to feeling pressure to defer maintenance because the client wanted the line up, the public's anger found a focus. Gu was called to testify before a parliamentary committee formed to inquire. Cameras filmed him through glass as he walked into a hearing room, his suit tidy, his expression managed. The headlines were brutal on the day of the hearing. People who had once applauded his philanthropic names on hospital wings now leaned into microphones like jurors and asked for accountability. Shao watched the broadcast from a small living room where friends had gathered. She felt, in the new kind of public ritual, an ambivalence sharp as cold wind. Relief that the truth might be told, and dread about what the telling would mean for the people she still loved, in one complicated configuration or another. At the hearing, Gu spoke carefully. He described the company's safety protocols, the audits, and the steps taken in the months since the accident. He said words like regret and responsibility in ways rehearsed by counsel. The committee pushed. "Did you or anyone in your company instruct vendors to delay maintenance?" an authority asked. He answered in layered corporate language. The committee published its preliminary findings, and even the most sympathetic commentators could not avoid noting that the culture of deferred maintenance had been present. There was a moment in the hearing, however, that pivoted the narrative. A former executive, someone who had been close to Gu in earlier years and who had once worked under him, stepped forward and did something unexpected. He testified that, in the past, he had been pressured by the family's insistence on cost management, and that practices had been normalized in ways that allowed corners to be cut. The testimony was messy, self-incriminating, and, crucially, truthful in a way that could be verified by documents and subsequent vendor statements. The committee convened a formal inquiry. The company's board announced a series of independent audits and suspended bids on some contracts. The legal team began to talk about settlements and restructuring. The market continued to flex. None of this was simple. People choose to hold corporations to account in many ways, through lawsuits, regulation, or public pressure, and those avenues do not always heal everyone, but they redistribute responsibility in ways that make clear there must be consequences beyond private apologies. Gu found himself at the center of a storm he had not adequately anticipated. He was not simply the villain the press had painted him to be. His awareness of institutional responsibility had been partial at best. He had been complicit in a system that normalized risk. In the hearing's echo, he recognized a version of himself who had been willing to accept compromises for the sake of stability. That version, when exposed to light, looked small and ashamed. The billion-dollar demand had always been more rhetorical than literal in the public mind, a symbol of Shao's refusal to be simply paid off. In a week where the hearings pressured board members and the public called loudly for reparations to victims, the negotiation resumed with a different tenor. Shao refused to let the number be a trophy. She articulated in a short public statement coordinated with counsel that any settlement she might accept would be used to create a trust for victims and for a fund to support pediatric care and independent audits of safety in public transport. Harder things to spin into reputation management. Her insistence reframed the billion as a civic instrument rather than a personal fortune. When Gu signed the legal papers that established the fund, the click of the pen was loud on camera. He did not sign it as a theatrical gesture. He signed it with recognition that his signature now had consequences he could not buy back. The board released a statement outlining structural changes, and shareholders, restless, demanded management changes. Gu offered to step down as CEO for the interim, a move that would have once been unthinkable in a dynasty obsessed with continuity. The resignation was neither absolution nor a final punishment, but a public act that indicated his life would be different. The divorce that had been filed months earlier reached settlement terms that day. The agreement, legally dry and emotionally heavy, included a provision that a substantial portion of the proceeds would be directed to the victim's trust Shao had insisted upon. It granted her the financial independence she had demanded, but with strings that aligned with public good. The legal language mattered. It codified a moral choice she had made under pressure, that her dignity would not become a private transaction. There is always, after the shock of news, an odd lull. The city, eager for the next headline, moved on in many ways. It always does, but the change had been set in motion. People who had been silenced by proximity found voices. Policies that had been sloppy were examined. A child named Coco, who had once been only a footnote in a paper trail, was alive. There was, though, a smaller, lonelier reckoning that unfolded in rooms where cameras did not watch. Gu chose, in the months that followed, to go somewhere public contrition rarely reaches. Work. He spent long, unspectacular days at community centers, learning the logistics of repair from people whose lives had been disrupted in ways money could not fully fix. He met victims. He listened. His wife's absence from his bed was a daily presence. The blue shirt, neatly folded, began to live in a drawer that no longer needed to be symbolic. He learned to feel the small things that do not photograph well. A child's head on a shoulder, the soft, necessary labor of apology. Shao rebuilt without melodrama. She took roles that paid less and taught more. She set up a small production collective that worked with real stories, short pieces made by people who wanted to be heard. She collected bills and learners, established schedules that were not dictated by someone else's calendar. The studio had a cheap kettle and a map pinned to a wall where they tracked the stories they wanted to tell. Her life was modest again, and the modesty had a kind of freedom. Yao, who had once been a headline, had changed in the public mind from a figure of rumor to someone whose act carried weight. The donation did not absolve the past, nor did it erase what had been said about her relationship with Gu. But for all the cameras, she had a small private record of time in a ward where she had learned to read names like hymns. She and Shao did not become friends overnight. They did not pretend for press. They developed awkwardly a civility that sometimes opened into an understanding. Once, over a cup of hospital coffee that tasted like disappointment and caffeine, Yao told Shao why she had donated. It was the right thing to do, she said, which was not the kind of dramatic confession Shao expected. It was plain, and that only made it truer. Jealousy, which had once lived in punches of rumor and rumor's aftermath, returned in a quieter, corrosive form. Gu felt it not at the sight of Yao's acts, but at the sight of Shao's life moving. He watched her at a premiere for a short film produced by her small collective. She stood in the back, not dressed to command attention but to be present. People came to shake her hand, to ask about the trust she had insisted be set up, to tell her that her voice had finally become part of the city's current. He felt a sharpness, regret braided with something like envy, and realized that he had lost the ability to take for granted what he had once been given. He approached her after the screening. Her face had the tired, luminous look of someone who had done honest work all day. There was rain on the street like the city's little whitewash. The blue shirt he had cherished once, his sign of accessible power, no longer fitted the geometry of his life. He wore a plain jacket, and his voice, when he spoke to her, came out as if from far away. "You're doing something," he said. It was not a question, it was a confession formed into a small sentence. He was not asking permission to be forgiven. He wanted, in a complicated way, to understand what she had that he no longer had. Shao looked at him. She had, over months of small labor and larger hearings, cultivated a way of listening that did not collapse into performative tenderness. "I'm making choices I can live with," she said. It was not a rejection so much as an assertion. "You could have been part of that. You chose otherwise." He listened. The hearing he had given, the resignations, the trust he had signed, none of it erased the months of absence. Gu realized that the thing he desired, the life they had once been able to pretend they shared, was now occupied by someone else's meaning. There was no melodramatic fall on the pavement. There was instead measured acceptance. They did not reconcile in the cinematic sweep the tabloids wanted. There was no thunderous embrace and mutual confession. But they found themselves, in the months after the settlement, moving toward a kind of fragile, pragmatic truce. Gu attended a board meeting where the trust's governance was discussed and agreed to step up funding beyond what law required, not to buy conscience, but to make amends tangible. He attended community workshops where he listened to those he had once overseen. He visited Coco when he could. The child, who had once been anonymous in the press, became a small, bright presence at times. Gu found he could not pretend away his responsibility. The work of acknowledging it was long and boring and oddly purifying. Coco's recovery became a slow arc, not a miracle. There were good weeks and bad weeks. She learned to walk without needing help from a nurse. She learned to clutch a small doll with one button eye that she refused to let go of even during therapy sessions. Shao found herself, in the soft hours of visits, falling into the shape of a guardian that had nothing to do with titles. People called her hero or inspirational on social feeds. In the ward, she was just a person who tried to keep a child entertained between appointments. The title mother was not hers in any legal sense, but motherhood is a verb as much as a status. Months folded into a quieter season. The hearings published recommendations, suppliers were fined, policies about maintenance registers changed. The city had, in small ways, shifted toward a new insistence on safety and the public's right to oversight. May continued to write, now less of a hunter and more of a chronicler of how systems bend when people insist. Her byline on the long piece that tied the accident to corporate culture was cautious and precise. It did not claim to fix the city, but it did set precedent for scrutiny. Gu's resignation became more permanent than initially announced. He took a lesser role, one that involved transparency and no veneer, and worked, with varying degrees of success, to correct what had been broken. The public perception of him oscillated. Some said he had been punished enough. Others insisted that the man who had led choices that allowed corners to be cut must answer in fuller ways. He accepted the work because he could not unsee what had been revealed. It was a kind of penance made of action rather than spectacle. Shao's production collective grew slowly. They made shorts about people who existed at the edge of the city's narratives. Bus drivers, nurses, single mothers, children with diseases that did not attract camera crews. The work had meaning beyond career. She taught about dignity as a practical craft, how to write a claim that did not sound like a bleat, how to audition for a role that asked you to be both fierce and kind. People enrolled. The blue shirt kept being a small private thing in a drawer and rarely left the home. One evening, a small gala gathered to mark the establishment of a community fund set up in the wake of the scandal. The building was modest, the kind of space that had no red carpet, merely chairs and a podium. Coco sat in the front row, a bit older, her hair a little thicker, and her smile less wary. Yao stood at the podium and spoke about the strange humility of being mistaken in public, and of learning what it means to be present. Mei sat with a notebook that was doing slow service. Gu watched from the back, not with a camera's composure, but with a man learning to measure his influence differently. After the speeches, people rode home in rain that seemed like a benediction. Shao walked outside with the small doll Coco had abandoned on a seat and tucked it into her bag. She saw Gu waiting a few paces away, under an awning. No microphones, no lingering cameras. Just rain and two people who had been reshaped by events too large to be reduced to gossip. "You did what you said you would," he told her. His voice was small. It wanted something she no longer owed him, absolution. "I did," she answered. Her life had been rebuilt in ways that made the exact contours of his apology less crucial. She had a job she loved. She had fewer illusions. "I used what I had to make it count." He looked at her, and for a moment the old, complicated tenderness they had once shared flickered behind his eyes. Then he made a choice that had nothing to do with drama. He took an envelope out of his jacket and handed it to her. Inside were documents transferring some shares to the trust they had helped create. No headline, no spectacle, only paperwork that would fund safety audits and a pediatric ward endowment. She accepted the envelopes like one accepts a factual change. "Don't do it to feel better," she said, with the sort of wry bluntness that had always been part of her armor. "I don't think I can afford to do anything else," he said. It was not a plea or a demand. It was a recognition that some things are repaired only through labor meant for others. They did not reconcile as lovers. They did not return to the photograph in the box of the blue shirt and pretend it meant the same thing. What happened instead was a quieter, morally steadier thing. Agreements were kept, responsibilities transferred into institutions, and two people learned to coexist without illusions. People who had once been lovers learned to become participants in the lives of others in ways that did not require ownership. The city continued to spin threads of gossip. There were late-night shows that speculated on the possibility of reunion and viral posts that suggested improbable endings. Shao ignored them as much as she could. She had, in the months of moving, learned that the only thing that made jealousy sting was imagining oneself still defined by another's attention. When she stopped measuring her worth by the focus of a camera, the sting softened. Coco grew. The doll with the missing eye became a small legend in the ward, a thing children traded for bravery. Shao read to her and taught her to clap on time in plays the collective staged for visitors. Yao, who had been an uncomfortable subject in her earlier life, became a regular figure at therapy sessions and rehearsals. The public's appetite for narrative gradated into something less voracious and occasionally grateful. In the final scene, when the rain had last been bright enough to scrape the city clean for a while, Shao found herself standing at a small embankment, watching the lights blur across the river. Gu approached from behind, his jacket damp but carefully chosen. He did not put a hand on her shoulder. He did not ask for reconciliation. He spoke instead in quiet truths. "You moved," he said. "Yes," she replied. Her voice had the small strength of someone who could both mourn and make things. "And you were left with what comes when someone else chooses their life over you. It's a hard lesson." He nodded. He had, in his slow way, learned the meaning of being left to the consequences of his choices. "Will you forgive me?" She considered the word as if it were a thing that needed to be unpacked and placed in a drawer. Forgiveness was not merely erasure, it required a different architecture. "I can live without hating you," she said finally. "I can live wanting better things for other people. That will do more than revenge and more than a headline. He looked at the river, the lights trembling like half-remembered promises. "Then do it," he said. "Do the work." She smiled, not a smile of reconciliation with his choices, but a small, real one. "I already have." They watched the water together, not as lovers rediscovering each other, but as two people who had built something from the wreckage, structures for safety, small places for art, a quiet life that let a child grow without being a token. The blue shirt was still in a drawer somewhere, its collar ironed the way it always had been. It had lost its power to name them. Shao stepped away from the embankment when the rain slowed and Coco ran up, her doll clasped tight. The child threw herself into Shao's arms with the trust of someone who had been kept. Gu lingered on the embankment, watching them. There was jealousy still in the way he felt the absence, old, human, intractable at moments, but there was also a new thing, a possibility that he could use what he had to rebuild rather than to command. He turned and walked back into the city that had reshaped him, a man with fewer illusions and a longer way to go. Shao walked home with a small hand in hers, a life that had once been defined by being ignored, now filled with deliberate movement. She had been humiliated, she had been invisible, she had been made into a footnote by gossip. Yet she had moved. She had taken an envelope and turned it into a fund, taken a broken bracelet and made a habit of courage, taken headlines and turned them into a cause. The city would keep spinning its stories. Some would call her brave, others would call her stubborn. She kept walking anyway, and for the first time in a long while, she felt what it meant to be seen on her own terms. If you are drawn to these kinds of stories, of truth exposed, of small acts of courage that refuse to be folded into spectacle, subscribe and follow for more dramatized retellings of lives remade by decisions, by accountability, and by the quiet work of moving on.